The sound of my mother's hand slamming against the mahogany dining table echoed through our family's Christmas dinner like a gunshot, silencing conversations and rattling the Waterford crystal that had been in the Harrison family for 4 generations. "You're a disgrace! Get out of my house now!" Margaret Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been disobeyed, each word precisely enunciated with the diction that had made her Charleston's most formidable society matriarch. I sat frozen in my chair, the fork halfway to my mouth trembling as 23 years of being the perfect daughter crumbled in the space between heartbeats. Around the table, my aunts and uncles stared into their plates while my younger brother David shifted uncomfortably, his medical school success suddenly seeming fragile compared to the nuclear explosion of maternal rage that had just detonated. The cause of her fury was simple enough. I'd finally confessed the truth about my post-graduation plans, admitting that I had no intention of attending law school or joining the family's prestigious firm. Instead, I'd been secretly writing a novel and planned to pursue an MFA in creative writing, using my trust fund to support what Mother considered a frivolous artistic fantasy. 23 years I've invested in your education, your reputation, your future, she continued, her voice rising with each syllable. The finest schools, the best tutors, connections that other families would kill for. And you want to throw it all away to write little stories? Like some bohemian dropout with no sense of responsibility? I tried to speak, to explain that writing wasn't a hobby but a calling, that the novel I'd been working on in secret was already attracting attention from agents who believed in its potential. But Margaret's disappointment had transformed into rage that left no space for rational discussion. "Get out," she repeated, standing from her chair with the imperial bearing that had intimidated Charleston's social circles for decades. "If you want to disgrace yourself with this artistic nonsense, you can do it somewhere else. This family has a reputation to maintain, and I won't have you destroying it with your selfish fantasies." The silence that followed was deafening. My father, weak-willed as always, studied his wine glass rather than defending his daughter. David looked stricken, but remained seated, too terrified of becoming Mother's next target to risk standing up for me. My aunts and uncles had perfected the art of avoiding family conflicts by becoming suddenly fascinated with their dinner preparations. I left the dining room in silence, my throat closed with unshed tears that felt like swallowing broken glass. In my childhood bedroom, I packed 2 suitcases with clothes and personal items, leaving behind the debutante gowns, society photographs, and college awards that had once made Mother so proud. The trust fund she'd mentioned was mine legally, but I knew she'd find ways to freeze or complicate access to it as punishment for my rebellion. Walking out of the Harrison mansion that Christmas night, I carried nothing but my clothes, my laptop with its precious manuscript, and the devastating knowledge that my mother's love had been conditional on my willingness to live the life she'd chosen for me. 9 years would pass before I saw Margaret Harrison again. 9 years during which I would transform from the disgraceful daughter she'd cast out into someone she couldn't have imagined. 9 years during which her own perfect world would crumble in ways that made my artistic ambitions seem prophetic rather than foolish. When she finally appeared at my oceanfront home in Malibu, on her knees, begging for food and shelter, the woman who'd once commanded Charleston's social hierarchy was barely recognizable as the imperious matriarch who'd expelled me from paradise for choosing dreams over duty. But that reunion was still years away from the 23-year-old who drove through empty Christmas streets, homeless and heartbroken, with only her words as companions and her stubborn belief that some things were worth losing everything to pursue. Growing up as Margaret Harrison's daughter was like living in a museum dedicated to Southern aristocracy, where every gesture was rehearsed and every achievement was measured against standards that had been calcifying for generations. From my earliest memories, I was groomed to be the perfect embodiment of Charleston society values, beautiful, accomplished, and utterly devoted to maintaining the family's social standing. Mother had been a debutante herself, crowned queen of the Magnolia Ball in 1975, and she approached my upbringing with the systematic precision of someone preparing a prize horse for competition. Piano lessons began at age 4, ballet at 5, French tutoring at 6. By the time I reached middle school, my schedule was so packed with enrichment activities that spontaneous joy had been programmed out of my existence. "Kimberly has such natural poise," Mother would tell her bridge club friends, watching me curtsy perfectly for visiting dignitaries. "She's going to be a heartbreaker when she debuts." The Harrison women have always been the most sought-after belles in Charleston. The pressure to be perfect was relentless but invisible, woven into daily life so seamlessly that I didn't recognize it as pressure until much later. Grades below A- triggered disappointed sighs and additional tutoring. Social missteps resulted in lengthy lectures about family reputation and proper behavior. Even my friendships were managed, steered toward girls from appropriate families who could enhance rather than threaten our social position. High school intensified the performance expectations. I was elected class president, starred in school plays, and maintained a 4.0 GPA while participating in tennis, debate team, and volunteer work at the hospital where mother served on the board. Every achievement was celebrated as validation of her parenting, rather than recognition of my individual effort. Kimberly will attend Harvard, naturally, mother announced during my junior year, before I'd expressed any preference about college choices. The Harrison family has sent children to Ivy League schools for 5 generations. Excellence is our tradition. I was accepted to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, choosing Harvard because mother's preference made other options seem like failures, rather than alternatives. My intended major, pre-law, following the path toward the family firm where I would eventually become a partner, was decided by family tradition rather than personal interest. But during my sophomore year at Harvard, something unexpected happened. A creative writing course I'd taken as an easy elective awakened something in me that all my mother's careful planning had tried to suppress. Professor Williams, a published novelist himself, recognized something in my writing that felt more authentic than anything I'd ever achieved through perfect grades or social success. "You have a gift for capturing emotional truth," he told me after reading a short story I'd written about a debutante questioning her scripted life. "This isn't just technically proficient, it's genuinely moving. Have you considered pursuing writing seriously?" The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Writing felt like discovering a secret room in a house I'd lived in my entire life, a space where I could be genuine rather than perfect, vulnerable rather than composed. But it also represented rebellion against everything mother had planned for my future. I began writing in secret, stealing hours between pre-law courses to develop characters and stories that felt more real than my actual life. My novel, tentatively titled The Debutante's Dilemma, explored themes of family expectation, authentic identity, and the cost of living someone else's dreams. Professor Williams introduced me to his literary agent, who expressed genuine interest in representing the manuscript once it was completed. For the first time in my life, I was succeeding at something that belonged to me, rather than my family's legacy. But success in writing meant considering a future that couldn't include law school, the family firm, or mother's vision of my perfect life as a Southern attorney who married well and raised accomplished children to continue the Harrison tradition. The conflict between my growing passion for writing and my family obligations created anxiety that affected my academic performance in pre-law courses. I was struggling with constitutional law and legal theory while excelling in literature and creative writing classes that weren't supposed to matter for my future. During my senior year, the tension became unbearable. I was living a double life: dutiful pre-law student during family visits, passionate writer during my authentic moments at school. The novel was nearly completed, and Professor Williams believed it had commercial potential, along with literary merit. The decision to confess the truth during Christmas dinner was motivated by exhaustion from maintaining an elaborate deception and hope that mother might understand that following my passion could bring honor to the family in different ways than her traditional path. I was catastrophically wrong about her potential for understanding. Margaret Harrison had invested too much in my perfection to accept that I might define success differently than she did. My artistic ambitions represented not just personal rebellion, but public humiliation that could damage her own reputation as the mother who'd raised Charleston's most accomplished daughter. The disgrace she threw at me that Christmas night wasn't just about my career choice. It was about her fear that my authenticity would expose the artificial nature of the life she'd built for herself and demanded that I continue. The studio apartment I found in Atlanta was a far cry from the Harrison Mansion's grandeur. 400 square feet of peeling paint and questionable plumbing in a building where sirens wailed nightly and neighbors shouted through thin walls. The rent was $600 a month, which felt manageable until I discovered that mother had indeed frozen my trust fund, leaving me with the $3,000 in my checking account and no access to the family wealth I'd taken for granted my entire life. The shock of genuine poverty was more devastating than the emotional trauma of mother's rejection. I'd never worked a paying job, never worried about groceries or utility bills, never understood how quickly money disappears when you're earning minimum wage and paying market rate rent. Within 3 weeks, I was surviving on ramen noodles and applying for any position that would hire someone with an Ivy League degree, but no practical work experience. I found employment at a bookstore cafe, earning $8 an hour to serve coffee to customers who often treated me like furniture. The irony wasn't lost on me. A Harvard graduate with a nearly completed novel serving lattes to people who probably earned less than I'd spent on sorority dues each semester. "You seem overqualified for this position," my manager Janet observed during my second week. She was a woman in her 50s who'd worked retail her entire life and couldn't understand why someone with my educational background was making espresso for tips. "I'm between opportunities," I replied, using the euphemism I'd developed to avoid explaining that I'd been disowned for choosing art over law. The truth was too complicated and humiliating to share with coworkers who had their own financial struggles. The isolation was almost worse than the poverty. My college friends were starting careers at consulting firms and investment banks, posting social media updates about signing bonuses and prestigious training programs. I'd deleted most social media accounts to avoid seeing evidence of the life I'd abandoned, but the loneliness of having no one to talk to about my situation was crushing. Evenings belonged to writing, though exhaustion from physical labor made creativity feel like another job rather than a passion. I would sit at my laptop in the studio's single chair, trying to recapture the inspiration that had driven me to sacrifice everything for the manuscript that was supposed to justify my rebellion. The novel progressed slowly during those first months in exile. Characters that had once felt vivid now seemed artificial. Dialogue that had once flowed naturally now felt forced. I began to wonder if Mother had been right about my artistic pretensions. Maybe I was just a privileged dilettante playing at being a writer without the genuine talent necessary for success. But Professor Williams, who'd remained in contact despite my changed circumstances, provided encouragement when I was ready to abandon the project entirely. "Every writer goes through periods of doubt," he told me during one of our phone conversations. "The difference between published authors and aspiring writers isn't talent. It's persistence through the moments when you're convinced you're deluding yourself about your abilities." His agent was still interested in reading the completed manuscript, but only if I could finish it to professional standards. That meant finding time and energy for writing while working full-time to survive, a balance that seemed impossible during the first year of exile. The breakthrough came when I started incorporating my experiences of poverty and family rejection into the novel's themes. The debutante protagonist's journey became more authentic, as I wrote from genuine understanding of what it meant to lose everything for the sake of personal truth. Working at the bookstore also provided unexpected education about the publishing industry. I overheard countless conversations between customers and staff about successful authors, market trends, and the kinds of stories that resonated with readers. My exile from privilege was teaching me about audiences that Mother's social circle would never represent. Janet, my manager, became an unlikely mentor during this period. She'd raised 3 children as a single mother while working multiple jobs, and she recognized something familiar in my determination to rebuild my life from nothing. "You're not like most college kids who work here," she observed during a particularly slow afternoon. "They're here temporarily while figuring out their real careers. You're here because you're fighting for something specific. What are you really trying to accomplish?" I found myself telling her about the novel, about my family's rejection, about the choice between security and authenticity that had led to my current circumstances. Janet listened without judgment, nodding with the understanding of someone who'd made difficult choices herself. "My daughter wanted to be an artist too," she said when I finished. "I couldn't afford to support her dreams the way your family could have supported yours, but she kept painting while working other jobs, and now she teaches art at the community college. Sometimes the long way around teaches you things you couldn't learn on the easy path." The conversation marked a turning point in my understanding of exile as education, rather than just punishment. I was learning about resilience, independence, and the kind of authentic voice that could only come from experiencing real struggle, rather than imagining it. The novel began flowing again, as I wrote with the authority of someone who'd lost everything, and was slowly building it back through determination rather than privilege. The completed manuscript of The Debutante's Dilemma was printed on cheap paper at the copy shop, where I'd become a regular customer, its 347 pages representing 2 years of writing during stolen moments between shifts at the bookstore cafe. As I packaged it for submission to Professor Williams's agent, my hands trembled with the knowledge that this stack of papers represented either validation of my sacrifice or confirmation that I'd destroyed my life for nothing. Literary agent Sarah Chen's response came 6 weeks later, delivered via email at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, when I was working the closing shift at a diner I'd added to supplement my bookstore income. "Dear Kimberly," the message began, "I stayed up until nearly 3 a.m. reading your novel because I couldn't put it down. This is exactly the kind of authentic voice that contemporary fiction needs. I'd like to represent your work." I read the email 17 times before believing it was real, not some anxiety-induced hallucination born from exhaustion and caffeine dependence. Sarah wanted to represent my novel, believed it had commercial potential, and thought she could secure a publishing contract within 6 months. The sale came faster than even Sarah had predicted. 3 publishers entered a bidding war for The Debutante's Dilemma, with Harper & Row ultimately offering a 2-book contract worth $85,000, more money than I'd earned in the previous 2 years combined. enough to quit both service jobs and focus entirely on writing for the first time since leaving Harvard. Your novel speaks to a generation of young women questioning traditional expectations about success and family obligation, Sarah explained during our celebration dinner at a restaurant I couldn't have afforded on my own. The authenticity of your protagonist's struggle resonates because it's clearly drawn from personal experience rather than research. The irony wasn't lost on me that my exile from privilege had given me the authentic voice that made the novel compelling to readers who felt trapped by others' expectations. Mother's rejection had forced me to discover who I actually was beneath the performance of being her perfect daughter. Publication brought unexpected attention. The Debutante's Dilemma received positive reviews in major newspapers, was selected for several book clubs, and generated interview requests from magazines interested in the Southern Society dropout, who'd written such an insider's critique of aristocratic expectations. Kimberly Harrison writes with the authority of someone who's lived both sides of privilege, the seductive comfort of inherited status, and the terrifying freedom of authentic choice, wrote the reviewer for the New York Times. Her debut novel is both social commentary and coming-of-age story, executed with remarkable emotional sophistication. The financial success allowed me to move from the studio apartment to a one-bedroom place in a safer neighborhood, but more importantly, it provided psychological validation that my choice had been correct. I wasn't a disgraceful failure. I was a published author whose work was reaching thousands of readers. My second novel, Breaking Glass, explored themes of family dysfunction and the price of perfectionism through the story of a young woman whose eating disorder masked deeper conflicts about autonomy and control. The writing came easier this time, flowing from confidence rather than desperation, informed by therapy sessions that had helped me understand my own psychological patterns. Breaking Glass exceeded the first novel's commercial success and established me as a serious voice in contemporary women's fiction. The advance for my third book allowed me to leave Atlanta for Los Angeles, where I'd been offered a screenwriting opportunity adapting The Debutante's Dilemma for an independent film production. Hollywood was a different kind of education from the bookstore, cafe, or diner work, but it was equally valuable for understanding how stories reach audiences and generate cultural conversations. The film, starring an up-and-coming actress who captured the protagonist's internal conflict perfectly, premiered at Sundance and was acquired for national distribution. During this period of professional success, I maintained complete silence with my family. Mother's phone number remained blocked. David's occasional texts went unanswered, and I avoided visiting Charleston despite book tour opportunities that would have brought me back to my hometown. The success felt hollow without family to share it, but I couldn't risk the emotional regression that contact with Mother might trigger. My therapist warned that reconnecting before I'd fully processed the trauma of rejection could undermine the progress I'd made in developing authentic self-worth. But I followed news about the Harrison family through Google searches and social media monitoring that I told myself was research for potential future novels. Mother maintained her position as Charleston's social coordinator. David had graduated medical school and was completing his residency, and Father continued managing the family law firm while avoiding any public statement about his missing daughter. The searches revealed no acknowledgement of my professional achievements in family circles, no indication that Mother was aware of or interested in my success. As far as the Harrison family was concerned, I had simply disappeared from their lives as completely as they'd disappeared from mine. By my 5th year in exile, I owned a house in the Hollywood Hills, drove a car I'd purchased with royalty checks, and had accumulated enough wealth to support myself indefinitely through writing and screenwriting. The disgraceful failure who'd been expelled from the family home had become more financially successful than any Harrison in 3 generations. But the success felt incomplete without resolution of the family trauma that had motivated my artistic breakthrough. I was successful but not healed, accomplished but still carrying wounds that affected my ability to form intimate relationships or trust that love could be unconditional. The therapy work continued, preparing me for an eventual confrontation with Mother that felt inevitable despite the years of silence. I would need to face her again someday, if only to demonstrate that her definition of disgrace had been catastrophically wrong about my potential for meaningful achievement. By 2019, 5 years after my exile from Charleston, I was living in a glass-walled house, perched on a Malibu cliff, watching Pacific sunsets while reviewing manuscripts for the literary magazine I'd founded to support emerging writers from non-traditional backgrounds. The foundation I'd established, funded by royalties from my 4 published novels, provided scholarships for first-generation college students pursuing creative writing degrees, young people whose families, like mine, might not understand the value of artistic ambition. My latest novel, Inheritance of Shame, had spent 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, exploring themes of generational trauma through the story of a young woman who discovers family secrets that explain decades of dysfunction. Critics praised it as my most mature work, demonstrating artistic growth that justified my early promise while expanding into deeper psychological territory. Harrison has evolved from promising debut novelist to major literary voice, wrote the reviewer for The Atlantic. Her exploration of how family mythology shapes individual identity resonates with universal authenticity while maintaining the specific texture of Southern Gothic tradition. The commercial success had translated into financial independence that would have seemed impossible during those early years of survival in Atlanta. My accountant estimated my net worth at approximately $4 million, generated through book sales, film adaptations, and speaking engagements at universities where I discussed the intersection of privilege and authenticity in contemporary literature. But wealth felt different when you'd earned it through struggle, rather than inherited it through birthright. Every dollar I spent was weighted with memory of choosing between rent and groceries, every luxury purchase measured against the poverty that had taught me the difference between wants and needs. The house itself reflected this consciousness, beautiful and comfortable, but not ostentatious. The rooms were designed for work and contemplation rather than entertaining, filled with books and art created by the emerging artists I supported through various charitable initiatives. I'd never married, though relationships with several men had progressed to serious consideration before foundering on issues related to family and commitment. My therapist suggested that mother's conditional love had created attachment patterns that made trusting long-term partnership feel dangerous rather than desirable. "You've learned to be completely self-sufficient," Dr. Martinez observed during one of our sessions. "That's a valuable survival skill, but it can also prevent the vulnerability required for intimate connection. Consider whether your independence has become a defense mechanism against future rejection." The observation was accurate, but difficult to address practically. How do you unlearn survival skills that had proven necessary for rebuilding your life from nothing? How do you risk emotional investment when the most important relationship in your childhood had been severed for choosing authenticity over compliance? My brother David had made several attempts to re-establish contact over the years, sending emails that I read but never answered. His messages suggested guilt about remaining silent during my expulsion, along with genuine curiosity about my success and concern for my well-being. "Kim, I know you probably don't want to hear from any of us," read his most recent message, "but I wanted you to know that I've read all your books, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. I understand why you can't forgive us for that Christmas dinner, but I hope someday we can talk about what happened." The emails were tempting. David had been collateral damage in Mother's rage, rather than an active participant in my rejection. But reconnecting with him would inevitably lead to conversations about Mother, about the family dynamics that remained unresolved, about wounds that had healed externally, but still felt tender to pressure. Instead, I channeled family trauma into professional work that felt safer than personal reconciliation. My next novel would explore sibling relationships damaged by parental favoritism, drawing from emotions I could access through fiction while maintaining distance from their biographical sources. The literary magazine I published, Authentic Voices, specifically sought submissions from writers whose backgrounds had been excluded from traditional publishing. Working-class narratives, immigrant stories, accounts of family rejection based on identity or life choices. Each issue featured work that challenged the assumption that only certain kinds of experience qualified as literature. "You're creating space for stories that need telling," explained Maria Santos, a novelist whose debut I'd helped publish through the magazine. "Writers from privileged backgrounds have always had platforms. You're using your platform to amplify voices that have been silenced by economic and social barriers." The work felt like the most meaningful application of my success, transforming personal trauma into institutional change that could benefit other people facing similar struggles with family rejection and financial obstacles to artistic development. But despite professional fulfillment and financial security, I remained haunted by the unresolved relationship with Mother. News about Charleston reached me through internet searches that I told myself were research, but knew were actually emotional archaeology, digging for information about whether Margaret Harrison had changed her opinion about my choices. The searches revealed that Mother remained active in Charleston society, still serving on hospital boards and organizing charity events, still maintaining the public persona that had been more important to her than supporting her daughter's authentic dreams. Sometimes I fantasized about returning to Charleston for a book signing, forcing a public confrontation where Mother would have to acknowledge my success or publicly explain my absence from family events. But revenge fantasies felt beneath the person I'd become through struggle and achievement. The house in Malibu was my sanctuary, but it was also my fortress, protecting me from future hurt. while potentially preventing the healing that might come from facing the past directly. 9 years after exile, I was successful and independent, but I wasn't free from the emotional patterns that Mother's rejection had created. That freedom would require a confrontation I wasn't prepared to initiate, but that fate would eventually deliver to my doorstep in the form of a desperate woman whose own world had collapsed in ways that made my artistic ambitions seem prophetic rather than disgraceful. While I was building my literary career in California, my mother's carefully constructed world was crumbling in ways that her pride prevented her from acknowledging until catastrophe became unavoidable. Margaret Harrison had spent decades accumulating social capital through strategic charity work, advantageous friendships, and the kind of flawless reputation management that made her opinions matter in Charleston's rarefied circles. But the foundation of her influence had always been more fragile than it appeared. The Harrison family law firm, while prestigious, had been losing ground to larger practices that offered comprehensive legal services her traditional model couldn't match. Father's reluctance to modernize their business model, combined with his increasing dependence on alcohol to manage stress, had created vulnerabilities that became critical during the economic challenges following 2020. "We need to consider merging with a larger firm," Father had suggested during one of their increasingly frequent arguments about finances. "The overhead costs are becoming unsustainable, and we're losing clients to practices that can offer specialized expertise we don't have." But Mother viewed any merger as admission of failure that would damage her social standing. The Harrison name had been associated with legal excellence for 4 generations, and she couldn't accept that their family business might need external support to survive. Her solution was to leverage their personal investments to support the firm's operating expenses while waiting for economic conditions to improve. She liquidated their stock portfolio, borrowed against their home equity, and used David's medical school fund to cover payroll when client payments were delayed. "This is temporary," she assured Father when he questioned the financial decisions that were consuming their retirement savings. "Charleston society will always need quality legal representation. We just need to weather this difficult period without compromising our reputation." But the financial hemorrhaging continued as the firm lost 3 major clients to competitors who offered more competitive rates and modern technology. Mother's response was to increase their social visibility, hosting expensive charity events that demonstrated their continued prosperity while actually accelerating their financial decline. The turning point came when Father's drinking problem became impossible to hide from clients and colleagues. He began missing court appearances, forgetting important deadlines, and showing up to depositions visibly impaired. The South Carolina Bar Association launched an investigation that threatened not just his license, but the firm's malpractice insurance. Harrison and Associates became toxic within Charleston's legal community as word spread about Father's alcoholism and the firm's financial instability. Clients began requesting their files be transferred to other practices. Associates found positions elsewhere, and the family name that had once opened doors became a liability that closed them. Mother's social standing, so carefully maintained through decades of strategic networking, proved as fragile as the business reputation she'd prioritized over family relationships. Former friends distanced themselves from the Harrison financial scandal. Charity boards quietly requested her resignation, and the social invitations that had filled her calendar disappeared as dramatically as they'd once proliferated. "People in our position have to be very careful about associations," explained Jennifer Whitman, who'd been Mother's closest friend for 20 years, before suddenly becoming unavailable for their weekly lunches. "The community expects certain standards from board members and social leaders." The rejection was devastating for someone who'd built her identity around social acceptance and community leadership. Mother had sacrificed her daughter's relationship to maintain family reputation, only to discover that reputation was contingent on financial stability rather than moral superiority. By 2022, the Harrison mansion was in foreclosure. Father was in rehabilitation for alcoholism, and Mother was facing bankruptcy proceedings that would strip away the material symbols of her former status. The woman who'd expelled me for choosing art over law was discovering that law without financial backing was as precarious as any artistic career. David, now completing his medical residency, offered what financial assistance he could provide on a resident's salary, but his resources were insufficient to address the scale of their family's financial collapse. He also harbored resentment about the college fund that had been liquidated to support the firm's failed attempts at solvency. "I don't understand how you let it get this bad," he told Mother during one of their confrontations about money. "You had multiple opportunities to downsize, to merge the firm, to make rational business decisions. Instead, you chose to maintain appearances while the foundation crumbled underneath." Mother's response was to blame external factors, the economy, disloyal clients, Father's illness, rather than acknowledging the role her pride had played in accelerating their decline. She couldn't accept that the same inflexibility that had led to my expulsion had also prevented adaptive responses to changing professional circumstances. The final humiliation came when she was forced to apply for public assistance to afford basic necessities. Margaret Harrison, who'd once organized charity events for Charleston's needy families, was now standing in line at the Department of Social Services, completing paperwork for food stamps and Medicaid eligibility. It was during this process that she learned about my success through a caseworker who recognized the Harrison name from a newspaper article about my latest novel's film adaptation. The woman who'd called me a disgrace was confronted with evidence that her expelled daughter had achieved more recognition and financial security than the family that had rejected her. The knowledge that I was successful while she was destitute added psychological torture to her material suffering. Every newspaper mention of my achievements, every social media post about my charitable work, every review of my novels was a reminder that her judgment about my potential had been catastrophically wrong. By early 2023, Mother was homeless, living temporarily with distant relatives who made their charity feel like punishment. Her options had narrowed to a single desperate choice: swallow her pride and ask for help from the daughter she'd disowned for choosing dreams over duty. The journey to my Malibu house required more courage than she'd ever needed for any social confrontation or business challenge. She was about to face the woman she'd called a disgrace and ask for mercy from someone who had every reason to refuse. The Greyhound bus that carried Mother from Charleston to Los Angeles was a far cry from the first-class accommodations she'd enjoyed during her years as a society matriarch. For 36 hours, she sat among people whose circumstances reflected the economic realities she'd spent a lifetime insulated from. Elderly passengers traveling to stay with family who might not want them, young mothers with tired children heading toward uncertain futures, workers commuting between jobs that didn't pay enough to afford car ownership. The journey gave her time to process the humiliation of asking for help from the daughter she'd expelled for choosing art over law. During those endless hours of highway monotony, Mother was forced to confront the possibility that her judgment about success and failure had been fundamentally flawed. She'd brought with her a manila folder containing newspaper clippings and printed articles about my career, evidence of achievements that contradicted everything she'd believed about my potential. The New York Times review of my latest novel, the Variety article about film adaptations, the Forbes piece about successful writers under 40, all proof that the disgraceful failure she'd expelled had become more accomplished than anyone in the Harrison family. "Your daughter's very successful," observed the passenger sitting next to her, an elderly woman who'd noticed Mother reading the same articles repeatedly. "You must be proud of her achievements." Oh. Mother's response was complicated by years of denial and cognitive dissonance. How do you explain that you disowned someone for pursuing exactly the career that had made them wealthy and respected? How do you admit that your definition of success had been narrow enough to exclude possibilities you couldn't imagine? "We've been estranged," Mother said finally, the first time she'd acknowledged our separation to a stranger. Family disagreements about her choices. "I'm hoping to repair the relationship." The admission felt like swallowing glass, but it was also the first honest statement she'd made about our situation since expelling me from Charleston 9 years earlier. For someone who'd built her identity around being right about social propriety and family values, acknowledging that she might have been wrong about my potential required more courage than any confrontation she'd faced in her privileged life. The bus stopped in dozens of small towns between Charleston and Los Angeles, picking up and dropping off passengers whose stories Mother could only imagine. She watched young people with backpacks heading toward unknown opportunities, middle-aged adults relocating for jobs that might or might not provide stability, elderly passengers traveling toward family members who might welcome or resent their arrival. Each passenger represented a life outside the narrow social circles that had defined Mother's understanding of success and failure. These were people who worked multiple jobs to afford bus tickets, who carried everything they owned in single suitcases, who measured prosperity in terms of survival rather than status. People whose existence Mother had never seriously considered during her years of judging my choices. By the time the bus reached Los Angeles, Mother's understanding of social hierarchies had been challenged by proximity to people whose dignity existed independently of their economic circumstances. The homeless man who'd shared his sandwich with a hungry child, the cleaning woman who'd helped an elderly passenger with his luggage, the unemployed teacher who'd patiently tutored a struggling student during the long journey. All of them demonstrated values that Mother had claimed to represent, but had never actually practiced. Finding my address required research that humiliated her further. She'd had to call David, admitting that she was in California and needed to contact me, enduring his shocked questions about why she was seeking the sister she'd forbidden him to mention for 9 years. "Mom, what are you doing in Los Angeles?" David had asked, his voice carrying disbelief that she'd traveled across the country without explanation. "And why do you suddenly want to contact Kim? You've spent years acting like she doesn't exist." "Circumstances have changed," Mother replied, unable to articulate the full scope of her desperation while standing in a bus station payphone surrounded by strangers. "I need to speak with your sister about family matters." David provided my address reluctantly, along with warnings about the pain Mother's rejection had caused, and advice about approaching me with humility rather than expectations. "Kim's built a successful life without us," he said. "If you're going to contact her now, you'd better be prepared to acknowledge how wrong you were about her choices." The taxi ride from downtown Los Angeles to Malibu cost more money than Mother could afford, but less than staying in a hotel while figuring out alternative transportation. As the city gave way to Coastal Highway, and then to the exclusive community where I'd built my sanctuary, Mother was confronted with visual evidence of the success she'd refused to acknowledge. The houses grew larger and more expensive as the taxi climbed toward the address David had provided. By the time they reached my street, Mother was staring at oceanfront properties that cost more than the Harrison family had ever accumulated during their generations of legal practice. My house, when the taxi finally stopped outside it, was more beautiful than anything Mother had imagined I could achieve through writing. The modern architecture suggested sophisticated taste, the location implied substantial wealth, and the carefully maintained landscaping demonstrated stability rather than artistic pretension. "This is it?" the taxi driver asked, noting Mother's obvious uncertainty about whether she'd reached the correct address. "You sure this is where you're supposed to be?" Mother stared at the house where her expelled daughter lived, processing the reality that my artistic ambitions had generated more financial success than the legal career she'd demanded I pursue. The disgraceful failure she'd expelled for choosing dreams over duty was living in luxury that exceeded anything the Harrison family had achieved. Standing on the sidewalk with her single suitcase and manila folder of newspaper clippings, Mother faced the most difficult walk of her life. Every step toward my front door was an admission that her judgment had been wrong, that her values had been shallow, that her cruelty had been motivated by fear rather than wisdom. She'd spent 9 years convincing herself that my success was temporary, that artistic careers were inherently unstable, that I would eventually return to Charleston defeated and grateful for family forgiveness. Instead, she was the one seeking forgiveness from someone who'd proven that success could be built on authenticity rather than conformity. The doorbell's chime echoed through what sounded like a substantial interior space. Through the glass panels flanking the front door, Mother could see artwork and furniture that suggested both wealth and taste, evidence of a life built through choices she'd dismissed as irresponsible. When footsteps approached from inside the house, Mother realized she had no idea what she would say to the daughter she'd expelled for being a disgrace. "How do you ask for help from someone you've publicly humiliated? How do you request mercy from someone you've never shown compassion?" The door opened, and Mother found herself face to face with the woman she'd last seen as a 23-year-old failure leaving the Harrison mansion in shame. 9 years had transformed her expelled daughter into someone confident, successful, and completely unknown to the mother who'd thought she understood everything about her child's potential. "Hello, Mother," I said, my voice carefully neutral as I processed the shock of seeing Margaret Harrison on my doorstep after nearly a decade of silence. "This is unexpected." Mother's carefully rehearsed speeches about family reconciliation evaporated as she confronted the reality of my success and her own desperation. The words that emerged instead were honest in ways she'd never risked before. "Kimberly," she said, her voice breaking with emotion she couldn't control, "I need your help. I've lost everything, and I don't have anywhere else to go." Standing face to face with my mother after 9 years of silence was like encountering a ghost who'd materialized from a life I'd thought was permanently buried. The woman on my doorstep bore little resemblance to the imperious matriarch who'd expelled me from Charleston. Her designer clothes had been replaced by discount store garments. Her perfect posture had given way to the hunched shoulders of defeat, and her eyes held desperation that would have been unimaginable during her years of social dominance. "I need your help," she repeated, her voice trembling with the effort of speaking words that violated every principle of pride and superiority she'd spent a lifetime cultivating. "I've lost everything, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The moment stretched between us like a chasm filled with years of hurt, silence, and misunderstanding. Part of me wanted to close the door immediately, to protect the peace I'd built from the chaos that Mother's presence always brought. But a larger part was stunned by the transformation of someone I'd thought was invincible into this broken woman begging for assistance from the daughter she'd called a disgrace. "Come inside," I said finally, stepping back to allow her entry into the home she'd never imagined I could afford. "We need to talk." Mother moved through my foyer with the careful steps of someone who'd learned not to assume welcome anywhere. Her eyes took in the artwork on my walls, the hardwood floors, the ocean view visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, all evidence of success that contradicted her predictions about my artistic ambitions. "Your house is beautiful," she said, her voice carrying wonder mixed with something that might have been regret. "I had no idea you'd become so successful." I led her to the living room where I'd conducted interviews with national magazines, where I'd celebrated book deals with champagne that cost more than her bus ticket to California. The space was designed for comfort and contemplation, filled with books and art that reflected values she'd once dismissed as impractical. "Sit down," I said, gesturing toward the sofa where I'd written portions of novels that had generated the wealth to purchase this sanctuary. "Tell me what's happened." Mother perched on the edge of the cushion as if preparing to flee, her hands clutching the manila folder she'd carried across the country. When she began speaking, the story emerged in fragments. Father's alcoholism, the law firm's collapse, their financial ruin, her homelessness. "The house is gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The firm is bankrupt. Your father is in rehabilitation. And I have nothing left. No money, no home, no friends who will help me. Everyone I thought cared about me disappeared when the money ran out." The admission was devastating to witness. This was the woman who'd valued social standing above family relationships, who'd expelled her daughter for choosing authenticity over appearances, who'd built her identity around community respect that had proven entirely conditional on financial stability. "What about David?" I asked, though her presence in my living room suggested that my brother's medical resident salary wasn't sufficient to address the scope of their family's collapse. "David helps when he can, but he's drowning in his own debt, and he's angry about the college fund I used to keep the firm running," Mother replied. "He blames me for the financial decisions that led to the situation, and he's not wrong." She opened the manila folder with shaking hands, revealing the newspaper clippings and printed articles she'd collected about my career. Seeing my achievements through her eyes, evidence of success she'd never acknowledged, was both gratifying and heartbreaking. "I brought these because I wanted you to know that I've been following your career," she said, spreading the articles across my coffee table like offerings at an altar. "Every book, every review, every award. I know how wrong I was about your potential." The admission hung between us like smoke from a fire that had consumed our family relationships. Mother was acknowledging not just my success, but her fundamental misjudgment about what constituted a meaningful life. "You were following my career?" I asked, processing the implication that she'd been aware of my achievements while maintaining public silence about my existence. "I have all your books," she said, her voice breaking with emotion she could no longer control. "I've read them multiple times. The characters, the themes, the insights about family dysfunction. I recognized myself in the antagonists. I understood that you were writing about us, about me, about the damage I caused by prioritizing reputation over relationships." The confession was more than I'd expected from someone who'd spent 9 years denying my value. Mother wasn't just asking for financial assistance. She was acknowledging that my art had been meaningful, that my insights about family dynamics had been accurate, that my choice to pursue authenticity over conformity had been vindicated by results she couldn't ignore. "I know I have no right to ask for your help," she continued, tears streaming down her face in ways I'd never seen during my childhood. "I called you a disgrace, expelled you from the family, denied your worth for years, but I'm desperate, and you're the only family member who has the resources to help me." The irony was staggering. The daughter she'd dismissed as a failure was now the most successful member of the Harrison family, the only one with sufficient wealth to address their crisis. My artistic ambitions had generated more financial security than their prestigious law practice had ever achieved. But beyond the irony was a more complex emotional reality. This was my mother, broken and humiliated, asking for mercy from someone she'd shown no compassion. The woman who'd prioritized pride over love was now sacrificing that pride to request assistance she desperately needed. "Mother," I said carefully, choosing words that would either begin healing or inflict the kind of justified revenge she probably expected. "You can stay here tonight. We'll figure out everything else tomorrow." The relief that crossed her face was profound enough to reshape her features, transforming her from defeated stranger back into someone who resembled the mother I'd once loved. But I also knew that invitation was just the beginning of a conversation that would require confronting decades of pain, misunderstanding, and the different definitions of success that had divided our family. The woman who'd expelled me for being a disgrace was now dependent on that same daughter's grace, and neither of us was prepared for the emotional complexity that arrangement would create. The guest bedroom where I settled Mother that night had been designed for visiting friends and colleagues, not for reconciliation with family members who'd spent years denying my existence. As she unpacked her single suitcase, the disparity between her few remaining possessions and the luxury of my home created visual evidence of how completely our circumstances had reversed. The next morning, We sat on my deck overlooking the Pacific, drinking coffee that cost more per pound than Mother had been spending on groceries during her final months in Charleston. The ocean view that had become routine for me was clearly overwhelming for someone who'd never seen the Pacific before. Another reminder of the distance, geographic and emotional, that had grown between us. "I need to understand something," I said, setting down my cup and facing the woman who'd shaped my childhood through expectations I could never meet. "When you expelled me that Christmas, did you really believe I was making a mistake? Or were you more concerned about how my choices would reflect on your reputation?" Mother's silence stretched long enough to suggest she was confronting a question she'd avoided answering honestly for 9 years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of self-examination that had been forced by circumstances rather than chosen voluntarily. "Both," she admitted. "I genuinely believed that artistic careers were unstable, that you were throwing away security for fantasy. But I was also terrified of what people would think about a Harrison daughter choosing writing over law. My entire identity was built around social respect, and your rebellion threatened that foundation." The honesty was more than I'd expected from someone who'd spent decades avoiding emotional vulnerability. Mother was acknowledging that her reaction had been motivated by fear rather than wisdom, by concern for appearances rather than authentic care for my well-being. "Did you ever consider that I might be successful?" I asked. "That my passion for writing might translate into meaningful achievement?" "No," she said simply. "I couldn't imagine success that didn't follow traditional patterns. Law, medicine, business, those were the only paths I understood. Creative careers seemed like luxuries that only people with family money could afford, not serious professions that could generate wealth." Her admission revealed the limitations of a worldview that had been shaped by generations of inherited privilege. Mother had never needed to understand alternative definitions of success, because the Harrison family had always followed conventional paths to financial security and social status. "But you were reading my books," I said. "You were following my career. When did you start to understand that I'd been right about my potential?" Mother's smile was painful to witness. "The first review in the New York Times. Seeing your name in a newspaper that I'd been reading for 40 years, having your work praised by critics whose opinions I respected, that was when I realized I'd been catastrophically wrong about your abilities." "And you never considered reaching out?" I asked. "Apologizing for the things you said, acknowledging that you'd misjudged me?" "Pride," she said, the word emerging like a confession at a tribunal. "I'd invested so much in being right about your choices that admitting error would have required rebuilding my entire understanding of success, failure, and family relationships. It was easier to maintain silence than confront how wrong I'd been." The conversation continued throughout the morning as we peeled back layers of misunderstanding that had accumulated over decades of family dysfunction. Mother began sharing details about her own childhood that I'd never heard. The pressure she'd faced from her mother to marry well and maintain social standing, the fear that had motivated her rigid expectations about my future. "My mother controlled my life through the same methods I used to control yours," she said. "Conditional love, social pressure, the threat of expulsion from family acceptance if I failed to meet her standards. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment, but I was actually perpetuating patterns of emotional manipulation that I'd inherited from my own upbringing." Understanding the generational nature of her behavior didn't excuse the pain she'd caused, but it provided context that made her choices comprehensible rather than simply cruel. Mother had been enacting trauma patterns rather than consciously choosing to hurt me, though the impact had been equally devastating. "I've been in therapy for 5 years, I told her, sharing information about my own healing process, learning to separate my worth from other people's approval, understanding how childhood experiences shaped my adult relationships. The exile you imposed was traumatic, but it also forced me to develop independence and authentic self-worth." Mother listened to my descriptions of therapy with the attention of someone who'd never considered that family dynamics might require professional intervention. The concept that relationships could be analyzed, understood, and improved was foreign to someone who'd been raised to view family obligations as fixed, rather than negotiable. "I know I can't undo the damage I caused," she said, as our conversation approached its most difficult territory. "But I want you to understand that I loved you even when I was rejecting you. I was terrified that your choices would lead to failure and suffering, and I thought tough love would protect you from disappointment." "Tough love that included calling me a disgrace and expelling me from the family?" I asked, my voice carrying years of accumulated pain that successful career achievements hadn't fully healed. "I was wrong," Mother said, the words emerging with obvious effort. "Everything I said that night was wrong. You weren't a disgrace. You were brave enough to choose authenticity over security. I was the one who was disgraceful, prioritizing reputation over supporting my daughter's dreams. The apology was more comprehensive than I'd imagined possible from someone who'd spent my entire childhood teaching me that admitting error was a sign of weakness. But it was also complicated by the reality that words couldn't restore years of relationship that had been lost to pride and misunderstanding. "What happens now?" I asked, as afternoon shadows began stretching across the deck. "You can stay here while you figure out your situation, but we need to discuss what rebuilding our relationship might look like." Mother's expression suggested she hadn't considered the possibility that I might want ongoing contact, rather than simply providing temporary assistance before sending her back to Charleston. "You would want a relationship with me?" she asked, "after everything I put you through." The question revealed how completely she'd assumed that her rejection had been permanent, that I would never consider forgiveness despite her desperate need for help. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to find out whether we can build something new from the wreckage of what we used to have." 3 months after Mother's arrival, she was sitting in my home office helping to organize correspondence for the literary magazine, her careful penmanship addressing envelopes to emerging writers whose work I'd accepted for publication. The woman who'd once dismissed artistic careers as frivolous fantasies was now contributing to the infrastructure that supported exactly the kind of writers she'd tried to prevent me from becoming. The transformation hadn't been easy for either of us. Mother struggled with the cognitive dissonance of living in luxury funded by the career she'd rejected, while I grappled with compassion for someone who'd caused profound trauma while clearly suffering the consequences of her own choices. But we were slowly building something that resembled a functional relationship based on honesty, rather than performance. "This story about family estrangement is particularly moving," Mother said, holding up a manuscript submission from a young woman whose parents had disowned her for being gay. "The author captures the specific pain of losing people who are supposed to love you unconditionally." Her comment revealed how much she'd learned about the emotional territory my own writing explored, along with growing awareness of the broader social patterns that created family rejection. Working with the magazine had educated her about the prevalence of estrangement, the various reasons parents and children became separated, and the possibility that reconciliation could occur under the right circumstances. I'd been documenting our reunion process through journal entries that might eventually become a memoir about family healing and the unexpected paths that lead to forgiveness. The project felt important not just personally, but culturally. Stories about successful reconciliation could provide hope for other families, fractured by misunderstanding and pride. "I've been thinking about Charleston," Mother said during one of our evening conversations on the deck, "about whether I want to go back, or if this could be a new beginning somewhere else. My entire identity was tied to a place and a social structure that no longer exists for me." Her comment reflected psychological growth that would have been unimaginable during her years as Charleston's social coordinator. Mother was considering the possibility that starting over might be healthier than attempting to rebuild connections that had been based on financial status, rather than genuine relationships. "What would a new beginning look like?" I asked, curious about whether she'd developed any vision for her future beyond survival and reconciliation with me. "I've been thinking about the magazine," she said carefully, "about the writers you're supporting, the families whose stories are being published. I spent years organizing charity events for Charleston society, but this work feels more meaningful because it's helping people tell their own stories rather than having their stories told for them." The suggestion that she might want to become more involved with my work was both touching and complicated. Could someone who'd rejected my artistic ambitions become a genuine advocate for other people's creative dreams? Could she transform from someone who'd perpetuated systems of exclusion into someone who supported inclusion and authenticity? "You'd want to work with writers and artists?" I asked. "The kind of people you once considered impractical dreamers?" "I want to work with people whose stories matter," she replied. "I spent decades supporting causes that enhanced my social standing rather than addressing genuine need. This would be different, using my organizational skills to help people whose voices have been silenced by the same kinds of prejudices I used to perpetuate." The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, transforming Mother from someone seeking assistance into someone offering contribution. But it also raised questions about the sustainability of change, motivated by circumstance, rather than genuine conviction. During her 4th month in Malibu, we received unexpected news that would test the authenticity of our reconciliation. David called to report that Father had completed rehabilitation and was requesting contact with both Mother and me, hoping to repair family relationships that had been damaged by his alcoholism and their financial collapse. "He's been sober for 6 months, David explained during our video call. "He's working with a counselor about family issues, and he wants to make amends for the ways his drinking contributed to our family dysfunction. He specifically asked about Kim and whether there might be possibility for rebuilding their relationship." The request forced Mother and me to confront whether our reconciliation was strong enough to withstand reintroduction of other family members, particularly someone whose weakness had enabled Mother's controlling behavior throughout my childhood. "What do you think about your father's request?" Mother asked after David's call ended. "Are you ready to consider forgiving him for remaining silent when I expelled you?" The question revealed how much our relationship had evolved. Mother was consulting me about family decisions rather than making unilateral choices based on her preferences and social considerations. "I think people deserve chances to demonstrate change," I said. "But I also think reconciliation has to be based on genuine accountability rather than just need for family connection." Over the following weeks, we had careful conversations with Father through video calls that allowed us to assess his emotional state and commitment to addressing past behavior. He was clearly different from the passive man who'd enabled Mother's authoritarianism, more direct about his feelings, more willing to acknowledge his role in family dysfunction, more genuinely interested in understanding rather than avoiding conflict. "I should have protected you when Margaret expelled you," he told me during one of our calls. "I was too afraid of confrontation, too dependent on alcohol to manage stress, too weak to stand up for what was right. You deserved a father who would defend your choices even when they conflicted with family expectations." His apology was specific and comprehensive, addressing not just his silence during my expulsion, but the broader pattern of passivity that had allowed Mother's rigidity to dominate our family dynamics. The surprising twist that would ultimately define our family's healing came through my literary work rather than our personal conversations. My latest novel, The Architecture of Forgiveness, explored themes of family reconciliation through the story of a successful artist who reconnects with estranged parents facing their own crisis. The book had been inspired by my experiences with Mother, but it had evolved into something larger, an examination of how families could rebuild after trauma. When the novel was selected for a major literary prize and the award ceremony was scheduled in New York, I faced a decision about whether to attend alone or invite family members who'd never supported my career during its early development. "I'd like all of you to come," I told Mother, Father, and David during a family video call. "Not because I need your presence for validation, but because this moment represents something we've built together through the hard work of reconciliation." Mother's tears were immediate and uncontrolled. "You want us there? Even after everything we put you through? Especially because of everything we've been through," I replied. "This award isn't just about my writing. It's about the family healing that made the writing possible. We've all changed, and we deserve to celebrate that transformation together." The award ceremony in New York brought together 4 family members who'd learned to love each other through accountability rather than obligation, through choice rather than biology. When I accepted the prize for The Architecture of Forgiveness, I looked out at an audience that included the mother who'd once called me a disgrace and now served as my editorial assistant, the father who'd learned to speak truth instead of hiding behind alcohol, and the brother who'd found courage to bridge differences that once seemed insurmountable. This book exists because my family taught me that the most profound stories emerge from the most painful experiences, I said in my acceptance speech. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing to build something new from the ruins of what was broken. The woman who'd appeared at my door 9 months earlier, desperate and homeless, was now sitting in the front row of a prestigious literary event, applauding recognition for the career she'd once tried to prevent. The disgrace she'd expelled had become the family member who'd saved them all, not just financially, but emotionally, by demonstrating that love could be stronger than pride, that success could include rather than exclude family healing, and that redemption was possible even after the most devastating failures of character. But the greatest surprise was discovering that forgiveness had transformed me as much as it had changed Mother. The successful novelist who'd once measured achievement by independence and isolation had learned that the deepest success included family restoration, that healing wounded relationships was as meaningful as any literary recognition, and that home could be rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than performance. The exile that had begun with such cruelty had ended with grace neither of us had thought possible.